Welcome to Danica Raven's Bite Size Horror. Today I have the story The Curse by Lorraine Montgomery. If you're sitting comfortably, we shall begin. The old lady had been right. As he stood there, gazing at the flames, her words seemed to echo inside his head. She'd warned him that this place was cursed, and that he should get out whilst he still could. Scott wished he'd listened to her. He wished now that he'd convinced his mother to move back out while they still had the chance. Well, I'm sure we're all going to be very happy here. Scott gave his mother a look of scepticism behind her back. He raised the volume on his MP3 and ignored her. At age 17, he'd reached the stage in his life where the only company he enjoyed was his own. "We should go meet the neighbours once we've finished unpacking," said his mother. At those words, Scott groaned. Meeting the neighbours was the last thing on his mind. After unpacking, the first thing he'd want would be sleep. But, despite his protests, his mother got her way. They unpacked, they made up their beds, and then they were off. If Scott had received any clues that things weren't quite right in this block of flats, it was when first meeting his new neighbours. The first neighbour they met lived right across the landing from Scott, his mother and his little sister Alice. When he opened his door to them, Scott was greeted with the smell of weed emerging from the room beyond. The neighbour himself looked pale and thin, as though he hadn't eaten properly for several weeks. "Get out," he said sharply. Excuse me?" said Scott's mother. "You heard me," he said. "If you stay, something bad'll happen." With that, he slammed the door closed. The rest of the neighbours weren't much better. One flat was home to about 20 cats and a strange middle-aged spinster who gave them the same warning. Another flat belonged to a young couple who looked tired and sickly, as though they were wasting away of some horrible illness. Again, they received the same warning about moving out while they still could. The next apartment was inhabited by a man who claimed to be a professional moss salesman and tried to sell them several varieties of moss that he'd grown himself. The final flat belonged to an old lady of about 95 who cackled manically as she answered the door. "Well, what do we have here? New blood, I see," she said with a wide, toothless grin. Yeah," said Scott's mother. "So far you've been the nicest neighbour we've met." "Oh, don't mind those other weirdos. They've been living here for too long," said the old lady. "They told us this place is cursed," said Scott. "It is," said the old lady simply. "Whenever somebody new moves in, that's when it's most active. Once you get settled in, it'll calm down again. Well, at least until we get more new neighbours." The old lady grinned toothlessly at them. At that point, Scott's mother ushered both of her children out of the door. "Mum, they were really weird. Maybe we should move out," said Alice. "We're not moving back out," said Scott's mother. "We can't afford it. Not with my third divorce looming on the horizon. You'll just have to get used to things here." "But what if the place is really cursed?" said Alice. Scott looked at his little sister with his eyebrow raised. A curse sure would explain the strangeness of his new neighbours. "There's no such thing as curses," said their mother. "Now eat your dinner." Alice didn't look convinced as she looked back down at her takeaway dinner. "I wonder what the curse does," said Scott. "There is no curse," said their mother sharply. "Next person to speak about it is grounded for a month." They ate the rest of their meal in silence. Scott wasn't convinced that the curse wasn't real. Judging by Alice's face, she wasn't convinced either. It was a few more days before the subject of the supposed curse came up again. Scott was busy studying when his sister suddenly burst into his bedroom. Scott, look what I found." I keep telling you to knock before you come into my room, said Scott. He threw his pillow at her. She ducked underneath it and approached him. She shoved her laptop onto his desk, right on top of his school notes. He groaned and looked down at the screen. See, it's just like the neighbours say. This place is cursed, said Alice. She pointed at the screen. Scott looked down at her laptop and saw that she'd been researching the town's history. In particular, she'd found old records of people who had lived in this block of flats over the past 100 years. He could see from her research that every time someone new had moved in over the last 100 years or so, disaster had struck a week or two later. Impressive, said Scott. How did you manage to figure all this out? Well, I spoke to Margaret. Who? The old lady who lives in the flat downstairs. Supposedly, she's lived in this block of flats her whole life. Anyway, she kept records of everyone who's ever moved in here. She gave them to me. Then I did some research of my own. Look at this list, said Scott. Fires, floods, power outages, storms, all within 1 or 2 weeks of somebody new moving into the flats. Funny thing, these disasters. They only affect this building, said Alice. Scott, we need to show this to Mum. If this doesn't convince her that we should move out, then I don't know what will. Mum's going to flip her lid when she finds out that this is all you've been doing for the last few days. We still have to tell her what we found out, said Alice. No, said Scott, not yet anyway. Oh, we can't just sit here and do nothing, said Alice. We're not. I'm going to go and talk to Margaret. Scott flung off his headphones and stood up. His sister followed him as he marched out of his room and down the hallway. Their mother caught them just as they were about to leave the flat. And just where are you two off to? She asked. To get ice cream, said Scott, thinking quickly. Their mother gave them a stunned look. Ice cream? It's February. Yeah, but there's meant to be this great place in town. Makes its own stuff and all. We'll be back in time for dinner, said Scott. Well, if you insist. Yup, come on, Alice. He yanked on his sister's wrist and pulled her out of the flat. As they descended the stairs, she spoke to him. We should have told her what we found out. After I speak to the old lady, said Scott. Why her? Asked Alice. She seems to know more about the curse than anyone else, said Scott. If this thing is real, she might have some answers. And if she doesn't? Then we go to Mum with everything else we have, said Scott, and we'll demand that she take us somewhere else. They marched down the stairs to the ground floor, and then Scott hammered on Margaret's door. After a few moments of silence, she answered. Ah, Alice, you're back. And I see you brought Scott with you too. How wonderful. Margaret, what do you know about this curse on this place? Asked Scott. Everything I know I've told your little sister, said Margaret. Come on, Margaret. Where did the curse come from? How does it affect the people here? Why is it most active when someone new moves in? Asked Scott. Oh, you want to know all that stuff, said Margaret. Come in. This'll be a long story. Margaret spun on her heel and strolled back into her flat. Scott and Alice followed her. The flat looked old and worn out. The wallpaper and furnishings looked as though they hadn't been changed in decades. The whole place smelled of overly boiled cabbage. So, Margaret, where did the curse come from? Margaret took a deep breath before she spoke. 100 years ago, in this very flat, there was a murder. Not just any murder though, a dark and ritualistic murder. A woman's blood was spilled in the name of some bloody cult. I lived in these flats back then. Lived here my whole life. I don't remember the details. It did happen when I was very young. My family moved into these flats just before the curse started. Reckon we were the last ones who moved in without anything bad happening. And you remember everyone who's moved in ever since? Asked Scott. I don't remember, I keep records, said Margaret. Gave them to your sister. And the curse, what does it do? Asked Scott. feeds off people. Drains their energy, drives them mad, said Margaret. That's why all the other tenants are crazy. But when somebody new moves in, it's like the curse gets a fresh energy, gives it a boost. That's why bad things happen when people move in. You know an awful lot about this curse, more than anyone else, said Scott. Why is that? Been here long enough. I've studied it my whole life, said Margaret simply. Look, if you can convince your mother to move back out, I'd do it. Scott looked down at Alice. She looked really worried. Scott understood how she felt. They had to speak to their mother and convince her to leave today. Nope, we're not moving back out. I've made up my mind. But Mum... No buts, we are staying. Mum, the curse is real. I've been doing research and asking around, said Alice. It's real. And we only have a few days before something bad happens to us. We have to get out whilst we still can. I've heard enough about this curse, yelled their mother. There is no such thing as curses. I will hear no more about it. With that, she stormed off into her bedroom and slammed the door. Scott groaned. He'd never seen his mother this angry before. Normally she was warm, kind, and good at keeping her anger in check. Do you think the curse is getting to her? She asked Alice in a long voice. If it's real, then yes, said Scott. Scott and Alice spent the next few days trying to convince their mother that they needed to move out of the flat, but she was having none of it. She was determined that the three of them were staying right where they were. Nothing that Scott or Alice said or did would convince her that the curse was real. Before Scott knew it, a week had passed since they'd moved into the flat. All Scott had felt over the last few days was apprehension. Now that they'd been here long enough, he knew they were just waiting for something awful to happen to them. He could tell by Alice's expression and mood that she too was worried. Their mother seemed to be growing dark, moody, and angry. Both Scott and Alice knew why, but neither of them spoke it aloud. The curse was affecting her. 1 week after they'd moved in, Scott found himself waking up in the middle of the night. At first he wasn't sure what had woken him, but then he heard a noise coming from the kitchen. It sounded like someone banging pots and pans together. He groaned, rolled over onto his side. The noise had to be seen to. How else was he supposed to get any sleep? He crawled out of bed and dressed himself quickly. As he neared the kitchen, he could see through the ajar door that someone had left the light on. Carefully, he pushed the door until it had been fully opened. Inside, he could see his mother, her back facing him. She stood in front of the cooker, and all 4 of its rings were on. As the door creaked open, she slowly spun to face him. "Scott," she said. She looked awful. Her skin had become pale and chalky. Dark purple rings had appeared underneath her eyes. Her hair, normally sleek and styled, had become greasy and tangled. Overall, her appearance was very startling. "Mum, what's happened to you?" said Scott. "Go back to bed." "But Mum, I said go back to bed." With that, she screamed and then she lunged. Scott barely had time to throw his arms up to defend himself before she made a grab for him. He retaliated quickly and grabbed her by the wrist. He pushed her away and held her at a distance. She tried to swipe at him, but to no avail. When she realised her swipes were coming to nothing, she tried to headbutt him instead. Scott dodged to one side and pushed her hard. His mother went flying back, straight into the cooker. She screamed loudly as her bathrobe caught fire. Immediately she began to panic as the flames spread up her body. She flung the robe from her body and it flew into the kitchen curtains. They caught the flames, which steadily began to rise higher and higher. "Now look what you made me do," she yelled. "Mum, come on, let's get out of here." In response, she threw the kettle at him. He ducked and it hit the wall behind him, where it left a huge dent. By now the flames had begun to spread along the kitchen cabinets. The smoke alarm blared to life. "Mum, we have to leave, now!" This time she threw a heavy pot at him. He moved to the side and dodged the blow. At this point, Scott turned and fled from the kitchen. He closed the door behind him in a meagre effort to confine the flames to one room. Out in the hallway, his sister emerged, bleary-eyed from her bedroom. "Scott, what's happening? The smoke alarm woke me up." "We have to get out of here. Move." He grabbed her wrist and pulled her out of the flat. As they entered the hallway, they spied their neighbours leaving their own flats. The weed-smoking man from across the hall caught them as they moved to the stairs. "What happened?" he asked. "Curse caught up with us," said Scott. "Told you," said the man. "Didn't say I didn't warn you." "I phoned the fire brigade, by the way." "Thanks," said Scott absently. He ushered his sister out of the building completely. As they stood out in the street, they watched the flames engulf their entire apartment. His little sister looked up at him, her eyes wide in fear. "Scott, where's Mum?" At that moment they heard a loud crashing noise, the sound of glass being broken. They looked up together at what had once been the kitchen window. Their mother, engulfed in flame, fell from the window and onto the ground, her loud shrieks and screams echoing into the night. "That's what the cult did," said Alice, so quietly that she was practically whispering. "They took women who were promiscuous, sacrificed them to their god." Scott looked around at the residents who'd gathered in the street. Margaret was nowhere to be seen. He looked up at what he knew to be her bedroom window. He saw her there, smiling happily at him as though nothing had happened. Her grin widened briefly, then her light went out. That was another story by Lorraine Montgomery. Big shout out to Lorraine for letting us use another one of her stories on the show. If you'd like to send in a piece of your own work, please contact us in the links below.